Welcome to Glasnost in our time where we dare to think and dare others to think about the unthinkable. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. Today is 16th of June, 2022. It's the fourth month of the war in Ukraine. Is it a war without end? We want to know. Is it going to be a war that's going to end in a victory for Ukraine? Many are saying now that it's going to be necessary for Ukraine to win, and Ukraine still maintains that it's necessary to win this thing. So we want to know how far everybody's going to go in order to achieve that victory. And the first thing we think when we think about a victory is there's going to have to be escalation. The most pressing question of all is there a moral obligation now that Biden and NATO have taken on to escalate up to the degree of getting a victory? And does that entail World War III? Does it entail the risk of nuclear war? So to discuss this question, I am making reference now to a very interesting article that appeared in War on the Rocks on the 6th of June, 2022. The authors are Bear Braumuller. He's a professor of history at Ohio State, and Michael Lopate, who's a doctoral candidate there. This is mostly Michael Lopate's project, I understand. And the title is Western Leaders Ought to Take Escalation Over Ukraine Seriously. So we'd like to pursue that thing with Michael Lopate today. As I said, he's a doctoral candidate at Ohio State University. So welcome, Michael Lopate.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Let me ask you about some of the Western voices that you cite who are calling for victory over Russia. Who are they, and what are they saying? And what is this phrase that you use, virtuous escalation?
Well, I wouldn't want to name too many names. The ones that are there are just representative examples of a broader category of people who feel that we should, perhaps we must, intervene in Ukraine in a larger sense than we are right now for various reasons. Some think that there's a strategic element. We can, defeat Russia, keep them weak for a long time. Others believe that we must intervene on behalf of civilians, Ukrainian civilians who are, being killed en masse, and that's a tragedy that must be stopped. And I personally understand all of those positions, right? I completely get why they feel that escalation is something we should do, or we're even ethically obligated to do.
So we're ethically obligated then to escalate?
Well, so of course the ethics in international relations are a bit fraught at the best of times, but I don't think anyone could disagree with the idea that if someone is suffering an atrocity and you have the ability to intervene, it would be the morally right thing to do so. Right? If you can put a stop to genocide and you refuse, then aren't you complicit? Right? You're letting this happen. Some could say that the United States is at least somewhat responsible for the genocide in Rwanda for failing to intervene when we could have. And one could say, here we are making the same mistake again when we could do something and we're not. And I think that does create something of an obligation, but one that has to be weighed against other competing obligations, as we live in a very complicated world and things are very rarely black and white.
So there's a moral obligation. Well, so you've taken leave of the notion that foreign policy is based on national interest, and foreign policy is largely a moral exercise, I guess, for you.
Well, not so much for me necessarily, but even for me, I think that it would be foolish to say that there's no moral element in international relations. Even the staunchest realists tend to think that there is a moral dimension. You just should not, follow that to the exclusion of all else. And, you need to keep strategy paramount. But even as far back as Morgenthau, if not well beyond that, they have admitted that there is, of course, morality in international relations. And this is where people get into trouble, right? Because they will, sort of will privilege the moral above the self-interest, and take risks to satisfy their moral code that are perhaps not worth running. Now, I want to specify here, of course, many people who believe escalation in Ukraine is the right thing to do are not doing it necessarily for moral reasons. They do have a strategic calculus in mind, right? There are those who believe that defeating Russia is the main goal, right? Not so much saving Ukraine, although that is obviously important, but people like, for instance, I mentioned Elliot Cohen in the article, and even some, more recently, some Biden officials, particularly Secretary of Defense Austin and Secretary of State Blinken, just recently said that they are supporting the idea of a broader intervention to defeat Russia and weaken them so they couldn't, launch another attack in the near future. I believe, although both of them, I'm sure, have a moral center and believe that saving Ukrainian civilians is the right thing to do, they're expressing this in strategic terms. So they also believe, for those reasons, that intervention is still the right thing to do.
How do you understand this strategic purpose? When you say we want to weaken Russia, what do we end up with when we weaken Russia? How does that affect the balance of forces in Eurasia if Russia is weak instead of, presumably now it's strong, I suppose? Are these your suppositions? Russia's strong now, she needs to be weaker. She needs to be out of the ranks of the great powers, you think?
Well, I don't think so. First, I think that Russian strength is somewhat overrated, as shown by the results in Ukraine. Their economy is about as big as Italy's, or was before the current round of sanctions. And although they have a powerful military and nuclear weapons, they are much more a regional power, a large regional power, than like a global power like the United States or China. Now that being said, they're still obviously important in the Eastern European region, and politically farther than that. But I don't see that there's much to be gained for the United States in an absolute basis by weakening Russia. People have to think of this in relative terms. They think, well, if Russia is weaker, then the United States is relatively stronger, right? So that's good for us. But even though I sort of profess, a hard-nosed realist bent to some degree, I tend to think more in absolutes, right? What are we gaining? What are we losing actually, not relative to Russia? I don't particularly care about Russia. I want to know what is advancing the United States' interest? What are our interests here? And I think that people who are focusing on weakening Russia are sort of myopically thinking about relative gains and not absolute gains, or as I write in the article, really absolute losses.
Weakening Russia in terms of the United States, that's the way you like to think of it. But suppose we think of it in terms of Eurasia. If we weaken Russia, doesn't that automatically mean that Poland gets a lot stronger, Sweden gets a lot stronger, Japan starts to even consider thinking in terms of being a great power, being more assertive, and who knows, perhaps having nuclear programs. Doesn't weakening Russia set in train the possibility of some new nuclear programs by some new powers?
Well, I mean, most people would agree that Japan is, 1 week away from having the bomb as it is.
Yeah.
Right. They only don't have the bomb by choice. They have the technology. And, good on them for remaining a nuclear-free power, right? But in terms of Poland or Sweden, I'm not so much concerned about proliferation there, since the utility of nuclear weapons is not necessarily obvious at all times. There's also the consideration of, once you have them, they kind of become a terrible burden. And there was a question, certainly for Sweden, of is an invasion of Sweden realistic for Russia? I think people could have been more afraid of this before the Ukrainian war, right? People really overestimated Russian strength. And now it's sort of been revealed to us that Russia is not as capable as many had thought. And so certainly our Eastern European allies and neutrals might appreciate a weaker Russia in some senses. That still comes down to, well, we're the ones doing the heavy lifting, right? So if Sweden would gain some kind of advantage from a weaker Russia, what does that do for us? Right? What does it even really do for them? Right? It's not immediately obvious what the gains to be had are, except for the sort of ephemeral feeling of safety, right? It's not really based on anything, but they'll feel safer if Russia is weaker. I'm not sure they would be any safer, but they might feel safer. As for Japan,
wouldn't they be more ambitious? Wouldn't they think of themselves as the main power in the Baltic?
Well, I guess historically Poland was the main power in the Baltic region. Sure, you go back to the 1500s.
No, I'm talking about Sweden.
Oh, Sweden. Well,
yeah, at one time Sweden was the power in the Baltic, and being defeated by Russia meant that Russia became the power in the Baltic.
I'm not terribly concerned about Swedish revanchism. I don't know. Maybe this is just my own ignorance of their nationalist interest, but
okay. How about Poland? How about Poland then?
Well, I guess the question would be, what do we expect Poland to do? Right? Do we think Poland is going to invade Russia? Because if not, I don't think Russia is the one holding them back from attacking Estonia or Ukraine, which they're on the border.
Right? Holding who back?
I don't think Russia is the one holding back Poland from invading its neighbors. And I also don't think Poland is going to try and invade Russia to reclaim, I don't know, traditional Polish territory. Even if Russia was made weak enough that they couldn't attack Ukraine, again, I don't think anyone would support a similar invasion from Poland into Russia.
Well, one of my students from many years ago, Marek Chodykiewicz, he is probably the leading voice, I think, in the United States for this idea of a Polish intermarium, a Monroe Doctrine, basically, for the Poles in East Central Europe that includes the Ukraine, and it even includes the Baltic states and pretty much everything in between Germany and Russia. That is, it would be a Polish sphere of influence. He's a very enthusiastic champion of this idea, has written books about it, and has an academic position in the United States. He's an urgent voice on this, and it's something that historians know all about, about the Poles. And it's something the Russians are very neuralgic about, dealing with this whole question of the relations with the Poles. I'm not saying this is the only sentiment in Poland or anything like that, but this is one strand of Polish nationalism. Do you take any of that stuff seriously? And do you think the United States should take the view that our interests are completely compatible with this idea?
Well, I don't think the US interest is compatible with any sphere of influence by anyone other than us. So I think we would be pretty opposed to a Polish Monroe Doctrine that keeps out the United States, which is what the Monroe Doctrine would do if positions were reversed. So I don't think we would support that. And as we are an ally to many of the powers in the region, either through NATO or currently through sort of de facto alliance in Ukraine, I feel like there would be considerable pressure on Poland if they were to try and implement something like this to not, I suppose. Then again, I also think that spheres of influence aren't something you sort of declare. You either have them or you don't have them. It's based on your power, right? Whether if Poland has the power to keep out some amount of other power influence, then that's their sphere of influence. Russia is the same thing, right? What is Russia's sphere of influence? Depends. It's what they can actually control. Whether one says it or not, it doesn't really matter.
Pursuing this thought for just a second, I don't want to have this all be about Poland, but if we start to think about escalation, now we're talking about a victory for the Ukrainians, and we're assuming with this idea of the victory that new weapons, a long-range artillery, is going to turn the tide, and presumably the Ukrainians are going to beat back the Russians in the same way the Russians have been beating them back. And a victory is going to result. But suppose it isn't just a question of artillery, and suppose the Ukrainian troops start to falter and they still hope for victory. Somebody else is going to have to intervene. How do you see the escalation? How do you see the logic of the escalation in terms of additional troops being devoted to the pursuit of this victory?
A couple different paths it could take. One might be something like the United States support of South Vietnam, where it starts off small, so advisors, limited troops, only for defense of major cities that are currently under Ukrainian control, just take some pressure off the Ukrainian military, and slowly adding more and more as the situation becomes more and more desperate. That would be one way you still get escalation slowly over time. Another way might be, something more like Korea, where the United States declares, okay, this is it. This has to stop. We're gonna invade and put large forces in to prevent this war from going any further, beat back the Russians, and then declare victory. At least that was the plan in Korea. We'll put aside the reality. And this, of course, is putting aside any question of nuclear weapons. We're just putting things off the table for the moment. It doesn't be the United States. It could be other powers in the region first, right? So it could be Germany and Poland and sort of Sweden deciding that they would rather support Ukraine first with U.S. equipment and maybe some German troops to bolster the ranks. And if the war doesn't end there, it just continues to grow larger, because it's sort of at that point, once you're committed, it's hard to pull back. Right? It's hard to say we're going to put in, 1,000 American GIs or special forces, more likely. Some of them die in missions, and now we have U.S. soldiers have been killed by Russian troops. What do? Do we just leave it alone? We say, all right, that's it, we're pulling out, or do we feel compelled? Now we have to achieve some kind of goal, although we've at least lost these boys for nothing. So there's a number of different paths that escalation could take. Even that without being fully intentional, right? Escalation is often seen as both a strategy and a side effect, right? A consequence of war. And so while some might want to escalate intentionally to achieve something, once you do that, it's not necessarily up to you where it stops.
So the gravamen of your article, yours and Braunmuller's article, is that is a kind of a warning, I guess, about escalation. It seems incompatible with the idea that you feel that there's a moral challenge to achieve victory.
So here's where I think things are complicated. If you use an analogy, if Russia and Ukraine were two individual people in a knife fight on the street, and someone had the ability to put a stop to it, right? To separate the two, stop the fight so no one dies. If they have the ability to do so, then, there are some that could say that there is an obligation to do so, right? If, people, different individuals' moral codes, you could say there's no duty to intervene, duty, whatever. But I believe that some might say there is a duty. And I even subscribe to this to some degree. But what's important is that Ukraine and Russia aren't individual people, right? They're nations, and unlike in a fight between two human beings, where damage is inherently limited, there is really no limit to the damage that can occur in a war, And I think this is the point that many people forget is exactly how escalatory war can be. Right? People don't realize just how many people die in large wars, or actually how common they are. People might say World War II, oh, that's a 1 in a million war, right? That would never happen again. Well, there have been 95 wars since 1815, and World War II was one of them. So it's more often than 1 in 100. And that's just one major war. You could have World War I and World War II and Iran, Iraq. And now we're talking about, or starting to get reasonable odds of very deadly conflicts. And I think people don't really appreciate just how common that can actually be.
Okay, so far so good. This sounds as if you're issuing a warning about escalation and all of its perils. Can I get you to talk a little bit more specifically, though, about how can you imagine things turning into a nuclear conflict?
Well, okay. So before I answer that question, I want to stress that currently all data on escalation, every war that's been fought, has been a non-nuclear war. So I want to make sure it's very clear to everybody.
Well, except one.
Well, you could call dropping the bomb on Hiroshima a nuclear war, but at that point, most of the war had already been fought. So I don't think many would call World War II a nuclear war as much as it was sort of the advent of the bomb. But even putting that aside, every other war, certainly, no nukes were involved, and they're still incredibly deadly. So you don't need nuclear weapons to get mass casualties, right? It's, the United States did more damage firebombing Tokyo than it did dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Now, as how we get to nuclear escalation, that is a really hard question. And the reason it's hard is because it's really difficult to imagine a situation in which one intentionally presses the button to launch the first nuclear bomb. And the main reason for this is if you try and sort of game out what could happen, right? You should imagine what could happen if we drop the bomb. There's a whole bunch of negative infinities in that game where everyone ends up dying in a nuclear holocaust. And that makes it very hard for anyone to start the process. So now that doesn't mean it's impossible. I think that the most likely way you'd get nuclear escalation is through a series of sort of nuclear saber rattling steps followed up by a mistake of some kind. So what would happen is you'd have, say, Russia, putting nukes on the front lines, giving control of, small, low yield nuclear bombs to local commanders, and say, they have access to them. They'd advertise that, of course. They'd say we're moving nukes into theater, so people take that seriously. Maybe the U.S. does the same to sort of maintain the same level of escalation, so that we're not afraid. And then something happens, right? Someone gets a false warning. They think a bomb's been dropped. They think something's been launched, even though it hasn't. And they fire back. They fire first, as it turns out, thinking they're firing back. And now you've begun a nuclear exchange that no one actually wanted. And this, although it hasn't happened, has almost happened quite a few times, actually, including at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a number of times the United States almost launched nuclear weapons, and it was really only by sheer luck and people breaking the rules that we didn't. And so I think that is actually the most likely way we would get the first bomb, would be some kind of miscommunication or a technical error on radar after a series of escalatory steps and brinksmanship. And once the first bomb is dropped, then who knows, right? Is the other side obligated to fire back? Maybe they fire one small one as well to keep things even. That's part of the doctrine, right? Where we have bombs at various yields precisely for the idea that if someone fires off a bomb, we can fire one back of equal size, so that everyone feels like they're sort of equal again. But many people believe that once that process starts, it's going to be really hard to stop. Right? Once you sort of open the nuclear Pandora's box, what's to stop someone from dropping another bomb after that? Right? Again, low yield for technical purposes. Right? We don't have to all like the strategic bombs yet. That's far away. But even unlocking that box is possible to lead there eventually.
Well, right now, there's been an escalation already in this war. I mean, it started out being a blitzkrieg attack on Kiev, and then the Russians were bogged down. They blew out that bridge. They stalled the column. Javelins and drones had a big effect hitting that Russian column. The Russians started to conclude that blitzkrieg doesn't work, and now they're at the point where they've changed their tactics entirely. They're using artillery. So they use their artillery in order to get a decision, and the enemy never gets to even get a fight, never even gets to engage their troops. Their troops just occupy the areas that their artillery have prepared. Now, the US has the view that it's going to escalate, and it's going to create that kind of a power on the other side. The Russians, in order to counter that, have to use short-range missiles. And that's what they're doing now. So the Ukrainians have used this long-range artillery to attack Donetsk, and the Russians are bringing in short-range missiles in order to attack that. Now, the Russians have superiority at every step along this ladder of escalation, and it looks like it should continue. So you would think that if it goes to the level of nuclear weapons, it's just as good a chance as the US or NATO bringing it to the level of nuclear weapons, if they have to have victory. You agree with that?
I think once we start getting to the level of nuclear bombs being dropped, exactly what we want to define as victory is starting to be lost.
Yeah.
Does Ukraine really want to win a war where half the country has been somewhat irradiated and multiple cities have been burned to the ground? I mean, so I'm not the president of Ukraine. I don't know where they draw the line on what counts as victory, what counts as defeat, what are acceptable losses. But I mean, that is where that would end, right? You have slow escalation over time. They bring artillery, we bring artillery back, they bring missiles, we bring our own missiles and missile defense, or perhaps, institute a no-fly zone, which a lot of people have been calling for, to shoot down missiles, perhaps, or incoming fighters. It ratchets up, right? It ratchets up. And if they say, well, we must have victory in an attrition war, that requires a lot of attrition, right? I mean, that's what this is now, right? There was, as we mentioned, there was attempted blitzkrieg. It didn't work. And at that point, your options are just call it off, retreat, say that the mission was a failure, that's it, and cut your losses, or say, nope, all right, we're stuck in. It's now, it's a battle of man and wills. And that's the kind of war that you're not supposed to fight. And in fact, the kind of war there, if you think that's likely to happen, you don't start. Because there's almost nothing that could be gained that would be worth the cost.
Yeah.
Right. Already, I mean, I would say there's nothing that Russia could get out of Ukraine now that's worth the cost they've already paid.
But isn't that the case for the United States as well? In other words, we should make peace now.
Well, to some degree, it's not up to us, right? It's up to the Ukrainians. It's up to us to keep supporting them or not. And I feel like the US has got other interests at stake too. We're, supposed to be the defenders of democracy. And so we have this sort of image to uphold that we're going to defend people who are attacked by, sort of unprovoked aggressors. Also, there's, speaking without too much knowledge here, but I really imagine there's some sort of Cold War holdover where we really wanted to have this fight with the Russians. It's been, sort of been building for 70 years, and now we finally get to have it. I mean, I know evidence of this, but I feel like there were so many plans and drills in the military over the years about how we're going to defeat the Soviet Union, how we're going to defeat Russia. how we're going to defend Eastern Europe. And now those things finally get to be put into action. Now, admittedly, don't quote me on this because I really have no idea. It's just a feeling that that this is something. If you read people who are in like defense blogs, they're pretty hawkish about this. But yeah, so you could imagine it'd be it's in the U.S. interest to just say we're not supporting the war anymore. We're out, right? There's no good outcomes here, and so we should cut our losses, just like Russia should. And so then you have effectively a game of chicken, right? Where you would like the other side to quit first, because if they continue, it'll be a disaster. And the problem, of course, is that if nobody quits, you end up in a crash, right? That's the game. That's exactly what I'm seeing in Ukraine right now, right? Both sides should just stop, right? Russia should just pull out because they're not winning. Even if they win eventually, right? Even if it takes them, takes them the rest of the year or another year or two of this level of grinding conflict, their economy is going to be in shambles. They'll have lost hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, they've already suffered probably 20, 30, 40,000 casualties in 4 months. That's what estimates are putting out there. So that's 120,000 a year. If, current rates continue, is Ukraine worth that, right? What are they getting out of it? A country that hates them and will never want to work for them? They could stop right now with Eastern Ukraine and say, all right, we're good, we're done. These people,
but would they have to evacuate that territory? And then for them, they'd start to pose the question in terms of a moral obligation. They have to the Donetsk and Lugansk republics and you're thinking they would have to pull out of Crimea as well, I suppose.
If Russia's doing this?
Yeah.
Well,
that it's not worth the Russians even to think about Crimea anymore in your system of reckoning.
So I remember reading when that happened in the first place, that Crimea is actually costing Russia more than they're getting, right? Even though they took it relatively bloodlessly, just the process of just the idea of maintaining this region, which is pretty poor and requires a lot of investment, isn't worth it for the Russian economy. You can make claims about it's a warm water port, there's value there. But there's still going to be a lot of sort of place that need a lot of rebuilding in Ukraine, even if Russia wins, right? Even if they stop right now, we declare the war is over, Russia keeps everything it currently controls. That area is not going to be productive for years, and I imagine sanctions on Russian economy will continue, right? And I see no reason why we would ever take them off, not anytime soon. Just as a sort of punishment mechanism. And so that certainly seems like it'd be cost a lot more than any benefit. So if Russia were to pull out, sure. I mean, I think that Russia could probably afford to give up Ukraine and Crimea, the rest of it, everything else they've controlled so far, because those areas are not worth it on an economic calculus. Now, there are other calculuses too, right? There's sort of this idea about greater Russia, about the rebuilding the Russian Empire, and status concerns of being a great power. Right? Certainly, if Russia loses the war against Ukraine, then no one could consider them a great power anymore, right? No way. They lost against a small to medium-sized country in Eastern Europe. Yes, being supported by the rest of the world, but still. They couldn't defeat it right away, which was the plan. So I have a hard time believing that Russia would be willing to just accept that on their own, right? They'd sort of have to be forced upon them that they are no longer a great power and have to pull back, which again leads us to this is going to be a much larger, bloodier conflict where eventually Russia, the country, has to just give up because they cannot continue, right? It's too costly. It's too bloody.
What would it take to make it too costly and too much for the Russians to continue?
Well, that is a question that many people have asked themselves over the years, going back all the way to Napoleon. And there really isn't a good answer for that, right? What are the Russians willing to lose? I mean, no one knows, right? Even the Russian government doesn't know for sure, right? You never know what your people are really willing to accept until you ask. So it is possible that, should the war continue on and get worse, there could be, well beyond unrest to open revolt from Russians who are being asked to remobilize and accept, more and more of a war economy, and for what gain, right? This isn't World War II. They're not being invaded by the Nazis, so there isn't as much of a sort of a live or die here. But where that line comes, right, where the Russian people decide this is unacceptable and we're no longer going to support it in large numbers, that line could be very far away, right? Or it could be pretty soon. That's the problem. You just don't know, right? And this is the other issue where if we think that surely there's no way the Russian people will accept this going forward, they will stop the war. They will depose Putin, right? The military will give up, or his inner circle. It's too costly for the oligarchs, and they'll get rid of him. And if we think that's going to happen soon, then we shouldn't give up the war. We should continue fighting until there's a coup in Russia or something. But if there isn't a coup, then we just continue fighting, right? The war just goes on
indefinitely.
Yeah, as long as we fought in Afghanistan for 20 years, and every year we said this is going to be it, one more season, and then we'll have defeated the Taliban. Right? How many times did we hear that over the last 2 decades?
Mm-hmm.
And although Afghanistan was a relatively low intensity conflict for us, the fact of the matter is it took a long time and we didn't win. And if we start believing that same thing in Ukraine, and that was the plan, right? Support a low intensity insurgency, right? We would be supporting the Ukrainian Taliban, such as it is, for years and years, right? That would be the plan there. That gets incredibly expensive and bloody, even if US soldiers aren't the ones doing the dying. That's not even how it turned out. It turned out the war is actually a very high intensity conflict of the type that hasn't been fought in a really long time. It is incredibly expensive and fatal for a lot of people, right? The deaths are, we're already way above the halfway mark of deadliest wars, right? And the farther this goes, we're going to start reaching into top 25% pretty soon.
So this gets us into the territory of our wars getting more deadly. The Pincus, is that his name?
Pinker, yeah.
Yeah, that question. But let's not go there. Let's let me only ask you a couple of other questions, and then we can wrap this up. I want to ask you what you think about what political science, what realist theory in particular, what those have to contribute to all of this. You mentioned when you were talking about strategic calculus a little while ago, you mentioned Hans Morgenthau, and most of us, my generation at any rate, we learned all about realism from reading Hans Morgenthau's famous text, Politics Among Nations. And then we went from there to Kenneth Walt's Man, the State, and War. Those were the main books. We learned all about this whole realist conception. Are those ideas compatible, do you think, with the notion that NATO is an open door, that anybody who wants to come in NATO can come in, and we're not going to let the Russians determine who comes into NATO, or a related idea that we're still kicking around now, nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians? What would Hans Morgenthau and Reinhold Niebuhr and all the great theorists of realism, what would they say to these propositions?
So certainly all the major realist theorists that I've read up on would say that it would be absurd to have a NATO with an open door, anyone can join, right? Whether you accept allies or not is going to depend on what they can contribute. And that's not necessarily military, right? There's plenty of work on asymmetric alliances where the large state gets something else and the small state gets security. But it still has to be transactional, right? We're not just, the defenders of the free world, the United States world police. So the question, of course, is, what do we gain, right? I know there was talk about Sweden thinking about trying to join NATO. That apparently is I think Turkey's put the kibosh on that right now, for reasons that are truly unpredictable if you go back a couple months. But I think that it would be unwise to just accept anyone into NATO if we think of NATO as a military alliance, if we think of NATO as some sort of alternative UN, basically, right? It's an organization which is broader than just, a defensive alliance. Then maybe, right? You can get into conspiracy theories about the United States building a new world order. But without subscribing to that, I think that if we just think about NATO as a broad defensive alliance, then it would be, I don't think any realist would think that anyone should be allowed to join, right? They should only be allowed to join if they add to the existing member security. NATO is probably too big as it is. I mean, many people might say that, right? Like, why is Turkey in NATO exactly? Or why is Montenegro in NATO? What do they add?
It's the Serbian threat.
Well, I mean, we could defend them without being in NATO, right? I mean, it's not like we haven't done that before. There's questions about NATO enlargement that, some people have said this is sort of one of the reasons of the invasion in the first place. And no one knows for sure whether that's true or not. But people have said this is certainly putting more powder in the powder keg that was Eastern Europe. And I would say that most realists, certainly Morgenthau, which I know for sure, are mostly of the idea that you should only fight the wars you have to fight, right? You fight the wars that are in the national interests. So Morgenthau, for instance, famously was opposed to Vietnam. He didn't think we should do anything there. He didn't understand what the U.S. interest was in that country or the region, really. What are we doing there? Which did not make him very many friends in Washington, D.C. at the time. I think the same question can be asked now, right? What are we doing in Ukraine? And what risks are we running, right? You could make claims that we are doing the right thing. Again, I think that it is not wrong to say supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. And that's a broadly popular position with the American people, I think with policymakers, that, it's the right thing to do to support Ukraine. I think that what's important, what I think most realists say is, well, let's consider the costs. Let's not think only about the benefits or only about, our responsibilities. We have to think about what are we paying and what are we risking? Right? And the risks really are where you have to really start considering it, because the costs, the U.S. military budget is very large. We can afford to support Ukraine without too much damage, as long as it doesn't escalate further. If it does, that's when you start ending with, suddenly the U.S. is involved in a hot war in Eastern Europe. And even not wouldn't right away, it could be a NATO ally first, then Russia attacks that NATO ally, and then we have to get involved in Article 5. I think that it's always worth remembering that the risks are worse than you think. Right? Almost no matter how bad you think the worst case scenario is, not even the worst case scenario is global nuclear war. So no matter how bad you think the bad case scenario is, it's definitely worse than that and more likely. Just as an example, I have some numbers estimating what would happen between a war between the United States and Russia, and sort of the probabilities of a war of different sizes. And I found that in the least escalatory scenario, there is a 5% chance that the war would cause at least 500,000 battle deaths, 560,000 actually, but only soldiers. And you could probably imagine 2 civilians for every soldier there. And that's the least escalatory scenario, 1 out of 20. Is 1 out of 20 a low chance? I mean, yeah, it's low. It's not that high, but it's not like 5% chance things don't happen all the time. And imagine the downside. I think that's really what I was trying to get at with the War on the Rocks piece, is that we have to just really keep in mind, what are the risks? Let's be really serious about what are the probabilities and how bad is that likely to be? and we should use that to inform our decision. If we think those risks are worth running, okay, right? If someone believes that, yeah, we should run these risks because the gains are worth it, fair enough, right? That's their level of risk acceptance. But I think it's important that we make sure they know before they decide.
Okay. Let me ask you one question before we quit. How about this other idea that is being kicked around even now? Nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians.
So what does it mean exactly? I'm not sure I've heard this spoken as such. What does he mean by that?
Biden has used that phrase exactly. In other words, we're not going to make a Yalta type agreement. I'm sure Boris Johnson would put it exactly that way, a Yalta type agreement that excludes the Ukrainians. In other words, the United States and Russia are not going to come to terms without the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are the ones. What does that mean? Now, on the one hand, you could say that's very generous, and we're going to do everything for the Ukrainians. And some might even find that's quite naive. But there's another way of thinking about that. You could say that means the Ukrainians have to give in, and that means that's a way of maybe putting pressure on the Ukrainians. And this has been suggested lately. In fact, it's even been suggested that Biden is now criticizing Zelensky, and maybe he is even, some have said, throwing him under the bus. So what do you think about all that? Nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians.
I think that a lot of what political leaders say is cheap talk. And what the United States will do in whether or not we continue to support Ukraine or make a deal with Russia to pull out, and with them, let me start over. Fundamentally, the Ukrainians get a vote, right? They can continue the war if they want to, right? No one can tell them they can't keep fighting. The question is only, do we have to keep supporting them, right? And so we could say, we can't make a deal about Ukraine because we don't control Ukraine, right? We can make a deal about continued U.S. support for Ukraine, but we can do that anyway, right? I don't think anyone would argue the U.S. is bound to, support the Ukrainians indefinitely as long as they want to keep fighting. I mean, maybe somebody is saying that, but that does seem reckless to me, right? It basically, cuts. I don't think anyone to ever cut a blank check, right? That's usually a analogy that means you're doing something wrong. And although I think the United States would like Ukraine for Ukraine and Russia to end the war with some kind of settlement, right? Whether that's some kind of territorial exchange or not, right? Whether the Ukrainians win or they give up something to end the war in a sort of a settled way, that would be the U.S. preference. But eventually, it's gonna, there will definitely come a time where the U.S. decides this war has gone on long enough. It is costing us too much. We have other things we need to do, right? We have other military rivals we need to consider. We can't just spend all of our time and energy and money in Ukraine, right? Against, again, what I think anyone would really consider to be what I consider to be a regional power. Some consider a great power, whatever. Anyway, like, for instance, really, China really is the thing, right? How much are we going to focus on Ukraine and Russia to the exclusion of China? Eventually, there will come a time when we say we're giving up, right? You, Zelensky, have to end the war in the next 6 months, or else, the U.S. is going to stop supporting you because we have other things we have to do. Though, that time could also be pretty long way away. Again, with Afghanistan, it was 20 years. Though, in terms of costs, I imagine we'll reach the same expense as Afghanistan in a year or two at this rate, if not sooner. But the example is still there. Eventually, we will give up, right? It will be too costly, and we'll gain nothing, right? And that's really what it comes down to, right? What are we gaining? What are we losing? Everyone has to make that decision for themselves, at least if they're thinking strategically, right? If it's more ideological, right? If the government, if Biden believes this is, a war to save democracy, or that this is a war to, prevent a genocide, then it's not immediately clear where we stop, right? The strategy is how do you weigh that? How do you weigh genocide against, equipment, right? It sounds callous at any cost. And that's the kind of thinking that gets you to pay outrageous amounts of money, and more likely than money, start moving into, actual troops. And then you're in the same problem again, right? Where things are escalating because we feel we have to stop a genocide or to defend the world from new Russian imperialism. I'm not sure that answers your question about no Ukrainians, no about the Ukrainians.
Well, I think you have. I think you have. This has been a real exploration of the idea of risk and everything that goes into these calculations. And in fact, this has been a fascinating discussion, which we probably could continue indefinitely. But time restraints prohibit us from that. So thank you so much for all of this, Michael Lopate. This has been a fascinating discussion. So we thank you for your sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So there we have it, a discussion of risk, looking at all of it in terms of all the risks, and looking at those risks in terms of presumed obligations, moral obligations. Okay, all the things that go into a calculus of a question this big. So there we have it. We have to continue this. Maybe come back to Michael Lopate. Maybe talk to some other people who have written for this really interesting periodical, War on the Rocks, published by mostly military writers, and dealing with military topics. So we'll have to drop it though for the moment until next time, when we return to ask the question. We've tried everything else, so why don't we try thinking about it?